What's going on, everyone? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. Do you ever get the feeling that a regular old cup of joe just isn't enough to keep you up anymore? Well, the Pentagon has a new solution that it's planning to try out on American soldiers. And I know I say this a lot, but the latest development is literally shocking because they're planning to zap their brains with electricity. That's right, the Pentagon has already begun to experiment with this new shock therapy, which it says could keep the U.S. military's digital warriors and drone operators more alert. The Air Force, Army, and DARPA are all participating in 5 separate studies with a price tag of $200 grand a pop. This government already relies on video game methods to kill. So is turning soldiers into electrical conductors really the future of warfare? I guess it's time we update that slogan. The best part of waking up is an electric shock to the dome. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire we're told. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
When it comes to natural beauty, Arizona has it all. Traveling around to the state, like sites like Monument Valley, the Painted Desert, and the Petrified Forest all make you feel like a 19th century cowboy. And now there's another reason why it might seem like you went back in time to the 1800s while in the Grand Canyon state. Good old-fashioned draconian discrimination. See, yesterday the Arizona State Legislature just passed a law allowing business owners to refuse service to gays and lesbians, deny equal pay to females, withhold birth control for unmarried women, and skirt legal contractual obligations, all in the name of religion. Yes, that's right. This wide-ranging decree allows individuals to skirt federal and state anti-discrimination laws if the reason for doing so is on account of religious beliefs. Arizona Governor Jan Brewer has yet to decide if she will approve or veto the law, and similar legislation, has also been brought up in states like Idaho, Tennessee, South Dakota, and Kansas. But none of those bills have actually passed state legislatures, and as such, Arizona is poised to become the first state in the 21st century to codify discrimination on such a large scale. Anna Tovar, the state Democratic minority leader, even went as far as saying that, quote, many Arizonans will find themselves members of a separate and unequal class under the law because of their sexual orientation. This bill may also open the door to discriminate based on race, familial status, religion, sex, national origin, age, or disability. But I guess we should expect this kind of medieval legislation from a state that has repeatedly had its laws overturned by the Supreme Court. Back in June, the court struck down a requirement that said Arizonans had to provide proof of citizenship in the form of a birth certificate, passport, or another government ID in order to register for federal elections, despite the fact that no federal voting forms have this obligation. The entire purpose of the law was to suppress minority votes. According to the ACLU, in 2011, more than 21 million Americans, or 11% of the total population, did not have government-issued IDs, including 25% of blacks versus 8% of whites. Furthermore, a study by the civil rights group Advancement Project found as many as 10 million Hispanics across the nation were affected by these laws during the 2012 election. And all that worry and hysteria about voter fraud, well, the Arizona Republic combed through the voting records in Phoenix and found that since 2004, there's been a whopping total of 34 cases of fraud, and only 2 of those cases involved undocumented citizens. You also might remember that under the xenophobic leadership of Governor Brewer, Arizona approved the most extreme immigration bill in the nation in 2010. The law required that every immigrant have their alien registration cards on them at all times and allowed police to stop and question people merely if they had a reasonable suspicion that the individual was an undocumented immigrant. Because unfortunately, people don't tend to wear "I'm an illegal immigrant" name tags on their shirts, so you can never be too sure. Now, thankfully, most of this law was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2012, but codified racial profiling when it comes to weeding out, quote, illegals, still A-OK in the show me your papers state. But believe it or not, an even less veiled racist law was also passed in the state in 2010. The law prohibited the teaching of Mexican-American studies in the city of Tucson. See, the curriculum was all about scary subjects like Mexican-American literature, multiculturalism, and critical thinking. But despite the fact that the program led to increased graduation rates, high student achievement, and was even recommended for an expansion after an independent state audit, it just wasn't white enough for conservative lawmakers and judges. In fact, last March, a judge upheld that the ban on Mexican-American studies was indeed constitutional in a state that used to be Mexico. Since then, the Tucson School District has revived the program, but only due to a federal court order mandating it. So I guess Arizona's new discrimination law is just a natural progression of what happens when sexual orientation and race intolerance is continually promoted by state government as sound legal policy. Because after all, if Arizona's tourism board wants visitors to experience that old 1800s Wild West feeling, it's got to be authentic. Earlier this week, yet another banker died in an alleged suicide, this time in Hong Kong. 33-year-old Lei Jun-jae has become the 8th banker to join a list of deaths within the financial sector since late January. Jun-jae is the 3rd J.P. Morgan employee to commit suicide in recent weeks, raising questions over what is leading to the string of high-profile deaths. But should these deaths be looked at in a vacuum, or are they symptomatic of a cutthroat industry that thrives on pressure, stress, and results? Host of RT's financial show, Boom Bust, Erin Aid, joins me now to break it down. Hello!
An industry that thrives on stress, pressure. I thought you were talking about us.
I know. Oh, no, we definitely, believe me, all those same symptoms here. I call us the empaths, and I call the Wall Street the sociopaths.
There
it's
you
two
go.
ends of the same spectrum. Very high stress environments. We care too much. They care too little.
It's a problem. It's a problem.
It's a big problem.
Especially when you marry one.
Erin, you know, you have ties to Wall Street. You know a lot of Wall Street bankers. What is the root to this?
You know, Addie, it's a really good question. I don't think it's just one thing.
Yeah.
I think it's a variety of things. I think that, bankers, they go in glamorizing this idea and flicks like Wolf of Wall Street and Boiler Room and even Michael Lewis's Liar's Poker, which is kind of like the gospel that led a lot of these people from these Ivy League institutions to Wall Street. They expect so much, and then they get there, and particularly as lowly analysts, they're not getting paid what they thought. And yes, they're getting paid a tremendous amount of money, and you should have a little sympathy for that. But when you're expecting so much and you have glamorized anything, whether it be your wedding or your new puppy, you're going to be let down.
Right. I mean, yeah, these people are looked at as dollar signs. I mean, their whole expectation is to surpass their prior year profit.
Exactly.
I mean, they are constantly trying, there's pressure on them to maximize their bottom line. If they don't do that, they're looked at as, what's your role here? Why aren't you doing that?
Yes.
Going back to Wolf of Wall Street, I mean, even though people have said that it's a little bit sensationalist, is it really? I feel like it's very indicative of the pressure put on the industry. Sex, drugs, gambling.
I have to say, I do know a lot of people in the financial services industry, and I do think that yes, Jordan Belfort was a real guy, and yeah, he did all of that, but I don't think that everyone is like that. I think a lot of people today, they're jumping off of buildings. But here's the thing, like we were talking about this earlier, 4 people have, and that's reported extensively relative to how many suicides are committed. That's a big deal, but it is a little sensationalized. I will fairly say that. However, yeah, it does drive. It's a testosterone-driven industry with guys who need to be the biggest, baddest, toughest. A ton of athletes out of college go into banking. It fosters that type of personality.
Well, you bring up a really good point, which is that we're seeing all these banker suicides, and we're saying, oh, what's going on? It has to be a giant conspiracy. They have to be, is there another impending financial collapse that they know about that we don't? And really, there's thousands of people commit suicide every day. They're not millionaires, so they don't get the headlines. Really, everyone is a human being. We all need resources. We need help if we need it. And in this industry, I just feel like you have alpha males. The pressure is on you. You can't seek out help. I mean, you're considered weak in the industry if you try to say like, hey, I'm depressed. I'm suicidal. They'd be like, get the hell out of here.
Yeah,
you're not cut out for this job, kid.
You're not right for the position. And what's even sadder, though, is that, there's a lot of industries, like cars, where you work long, hard hours and you aren't compensated like a banker. But think of a doctor who has worked all night, but he might save someone, he or she, and they might get a thank you. They might not, or they might not, but they might get a thank you. Their bankers, they have a batting average of about 20%. Now, this is actually a real stat. Here we have here. Bankers, they only do about a deal or two. That's in a quarter that ever closes, tops. A deal to two. If you close 3 deals in 1 quarter, you are rocking it like no one else. So imagine spending your time and your energy all day, every day on a project that you know full well will never come to fruition. After a while, yeah, you are bummed out. And that dollar sign, if you're getting paid in restricted stock, not the cash flush ways that it was in the 80s and the Wolf of Wall Street days, you're going to be bummed. You're going to be really disappointed.
And, you know, I think the culture, you know, here we have a country that's run by a corporatocracy that's essentially run on financial looting. The pressure isn't necessarily on these CEOs who get immunity, they get bailed out. I mean, it's a total joke. It's put on the peons, the lowly peons, the ones that the pressure. And really, you know as well as I do, living in D.C., your job is your identity.
Yes.
It makes up who you are.
Which is sad, but
no, not to us. I mean, to a lot of people, you meet people at a bar and they're like, what do you do? And then their eyes just glaze over. It's like, oh, you can't help me financially or politically.
Bye-bye. Yeah.
Bye. I mean, it really is house of cards and that consideration. And really, like, I think the stakes are so high that if these people feel like they're losing their job or their identity, I mean, what else do they have to go on?
Exactly. And you know, it gets to another point that bankers a lot of the time, and this is coming from a banker that I love, my husband, who says that it's hard sitting at a table sometimes and people ask, what do you do? And you say you're in finance, and the whole table is kind of revolted. Well, maybe he kind of earned it, working for a living, but the fact of the matter is that's not going to make you feel great. And I think that there's a lot of that going on, less so in the financial services industry.
And you know what? That's such a good point, because your husband's so awesome and he's so great, and he clearly has empathy. And it brings me back to this study that I was reading in Psychology Today, that 1 out of every 25 normal people are sociopaths. That's just normal. And then according to CFA magazine, 1 out of 10 people on Wall Street are sociopaths. I mean, this is lack of empathy, no regard for consequences, unbridled risk-taking. I mean, if that doesn't define a Wall Street CEO, then I don't know what does.
No, it's Jamie Dimon to a T.
And think about these CEOs, if you're not a sociopath, like your husband, this could be a really depressing job where you're thinking, what the hell is going on? I mean, you know, what am I contributing to? All these things, it can really eat at you. And I doubt that every single person on there is a sociopath, even though as much as I'd like to paint them, generalize all of Wall Street. But I mean, really, you know, I think that there's all this pressure. And when your boss, when you're reporting to a psychopath, and you're not one.
Exactly. It's very hard to communicate. Sociopath, cool, that's crazy, but still crazy. It's like,
so, you know, what is it about the financial system that just breeds this, and what can be done to stop it, Erin? I mean,
honestly, I think it's a testosterone-driven industry, for sure. So what can be done to stop it? They're trying to take steps now. You know, a lot of banks have said that, no, we can't have interns working 20-hour days, and we got to give them at least 1 day a weekend off. I mean, it's a step in the right direction. Make no mistake that they won't get paid the same amounts as they would have, but I think at least it's a step, and I mean, it's not for everyone, that's for sure.
At the end of the day, we're all humans. We all need help, resources, no matter what job you're working at, and you know, suicide's a real serious matter. Thank you for coming on, shedding some light on it, Erin.
Thank you.
You guys, coming up, I'll shine a light on the world of shadow lobbying. Stay tuned.
Patients are force-fed.
Two explosions near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. More than 1,000 people have gathered.
What is the latest that you're hearing about the number of victims?
Washington, D.C. is one of the most expensive cities in America. And if you look at all the business suits walking between K Street and Capitol Hill, you'd think that the city is practically recession-proof, which might have something to do with the high concentration of lobbyists and billions of lobby dollars that are peddled through the city every year. However, according to the watchdog website opensecrets.org, for the third year in a row, overall spending on lobbying has actually decreased to $3.2 billion, along with the official number of registered lobbyists to just over 12,000. Congressional lobbying experts, however, argue that lobbying isn't decreasing at all, and instead it's simply going underground. Well, earlier I spoke to investigative journalist for The Nation, Lee Fung, who just published an article called "Where Have All the Lobbyists Gone?" In it, he takes a closer look at what's been coined the shadow lobbying complex. I first asked him why the numbers posed on Open Secrets don't reveal the full story.
Well, the numbers that you are seeing on Open Secrets, which is a fantastic website, reflect the official lobbying registration system that's maintained by the House and Senate. The problem is the statute, the Lobbying Disclosure Act, is riddled with loopholes. There are many ways for lobbyists to evade the law, and simply put, there aren't many incentives for lobbyists to register, and the law does not cover all lobbying activity. So the real figure on how many lobbyists are in DC that are actively attempting to influence policy is closer to 100,000, not 12,000. And experts say the amount spent is not $3 billion, but closer to maybe 6, 9, or even 10 billion.
Unbelievable. And you're talking about all these loopholes under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, named after former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. Why is he the face of unregistered lobbyists?
Well, Senator Tom Daschle left the Senate, joined a private equity firm, also joined a law and lobbying firm, Alston & Bird. He's now at another one called DLA Piper. He's become the face of the problem because everyone knows that Tom Daschle lobbies, that he meets with government officials, that he meets with President Obama, that he coordinates meetings with legislators, with policy folks, and businesses from healthcare and energy to other sectors. And he does this openly, and at the same time, he does not register. So given his prominence in Washington, D.C., helping President Obama with his healthcare overhaul, associated with many different think tanks and constantly in the news and at different functions in the city, he does all of this while flouting the law.
One of the most damning things about the article was Daschle's connection to the plan to have retailers like Gap skirt around responsibility for the Bangladesh garment factory collapse that killed more than 1,000 people. Lee, I was wondering if you could elaborate on that connection.
Sure. Well, we go through many different anecdotes, but this is one of the more tragic ones of how unregistered lobbyists peddle influence, and the public and the press is completely kept in the dark about who the real paymasters are. So for this example, if you look in the last summer, when in the aftermath of the latest major building collapse in Bangladesh, many European retailers offered a very strong plan to increase building inspections, to make sure that garment manufacturers or the retailers that pay the garment manufacturers are liable for these types of disasters. Well, American companies like Gap and Walmart and JCPenney did not like any of these reforms. They wanted to counter them. They didn't want to pay for any of these necessary upgrades or be liable for future disasters. So they had DLA Piper, Daschle's firm, go out and sell an alternative plan that does not keep them on the hook for any future liabilities, saving them a lot of money, but potentially causing more death and pain in the future. So what's interesting here is as DLA Piper lawyers and officials went around the city selling this alternative weak labor plan. No one knew that they were being paid by Gap, one of the big companies that refused to play ball. That's just another example of this shadow lobbying complex, that you have folks selling policy, selling influence, and affecting the way that these policies are enacted without registering and without disclosing. If you listen to their rhetoric when they were walking around the city selling this plan, they said that they're affiliated with think tanks, or they're simply former government officials. No one knew who was really behind this plan, simply because they didn't register.
And you give seriously dozens of examples here. I mean, this is just one of them that goes layers and layers and layers, as you're talking about right now. Lee, isn't there a way to investigate this? I mean, shouldn't the House Ethics Committee be overseeing the process of following up with those who are unregistered and still participating in lobbying?
That's a great question, and this was actually the most surprising part of reporting the story. I've covered lobbying and influence peddling for about 5 years now, and I did not know that the enforcement mechanism to the Lobbying Disclosure Act basically has no cop on the beat. There's never been a criminal enforcement case brought ever. There have been virtually no civil cases either, and that's because the only people overseeing this process of making sure people register and comply with the law, there's only one full-time employee at the Department of Justice. That's a contract paralegal who basically just processes the forms. Some other kind of file keepers in Congress also look into this, but if you simply don't register and you continue influence peddling, there's no enforcement mechanism to go after folks.
That's insane. That's absolutely insane. So I guess we know the answer for all the lobbyists. Just don't register. Lee, another thing in the article that you point out is the rebranding efforts on behalf of the lobbying industry. Can you give some examples of these and how renaming these institutions have changed their perceived role?
Right. I think if you look at public polling, Americans are incredibly upset about the role of big money in politics, the way lobbyists have taken control of the political process, have really taken control of both political parties. And to kind of combat this growing cynicism, whether from Occupy or the Tea Party, rather than changing their behavior or complying better with the law, lobbyists are instead simply changing their image, changing the names of their titles. So, for example, the American League of Lobbyists, a professional association for lobbyists, in November changed their name to the Government Affairs Associates, or Government Affairs Professionals. So that's a much more vanilla name. They take the L word out of it. They don't want to be called lobbyists. They call themselves other euphemisms like Public Affairs Associates, or government affairs, government relations, that type of thing.
I wanted to point to just one think tank here in D.C., the Employment Policies Institute. Sounds very innocuous, a widely quoted economic research center pushing the notion that increasing the minimum wage would increase poverty. But it's backed by the National Restaurant Association. Lee, do you think that the polarization of issues in this country can be blamed on ideological front groups backed by massive lobbying efforts?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. A lot of the political debates we see on television, in the media, are not much more than political theater propped up by characters who are saying what they're saying or pushing a certain policy because someone's paying them, and you don't know who they are. They'll say, oh, this is to help the Democrats or to help the Republicans, but in many cases, they're pushing a very narrow corporate interest without revealing who their true paymasters are.
How much of legislation would you say is written by lobbyists? I remember doing an investigation into just California state legislature, and it was like, I think 60%. This was a couple of years ago. I was just wondering if you had any insight on the federal level here.
Well, California, for all of its flaws, and as you know, I'm a recent transplant to the state, it's very corrupt, but at least you have a system of showing who sponsors bills in Sacramento. In Washington, and I just finished a reporting trip in Idaho, and the lobbyists actually wear name IDs. So there's a lot of problems in Idaho, but there's certain elements of transparency. In Congress, there are no such standards. Lobbyists write bills every day. They're sponsoring legislation, but there's no system to keep tabs on that.
Lee, you know, you mentioned before, of course, Open Secret's an excellent website. Even they aren't tracking the dark money. It takes something like you and very in-depth investigation. How do we follow this? I mean, what do we do to follow this trend here?
That's a good question. Well, I just relaunched my, this is a self-plug, excuse me, but last week I relaunched my investigative blog, republicreport.org, and there are many reporters who are following the money trail, trying to uncover these types of stories. But I have to say, it's very difficult because so much of the system has been pushed into the darkness. It's purposefully secret. And in some cases, you know, for this story that I reported yesterday, you only stumble into it. You know, the opening anecdote to that story of finding former congressman lobbying for Palantir, I just overheard him bragging about it on Capitol Hill. You just stumble into it sometimes.
Yeah, that's what I love about it. I mean, you were very natural. You were there on Capitol Hill trying to figure out what was going on, and you saw firsthand kind of the shady wheelings and dealings of all these people. You know, I was speaking to Jack Abramoff the other day, and he said that Citizens United didn't actually make it easier for lobbyists because they'll always find a way to get around it. What do you think, Lee? Do you think Citizens United exacerbated this problem?
Well, I'm of two minds on Citizens United and lobbyists. For one thing, it makes raising money for a politician easier. Instead of having to be on the phones for sometimes 8 hours a day for some of these politicians, begging people for these $3,000, $5,000 checks, you can just find one sponsor, someone who bring in a super PAC that can dump $1 million into your district. That makes it much easier. So it's kind of a counterintuitive take. At the same time, it makes corruption much worse because if a chemical industry lobbyist wants to pressure a senator or a congressman, all they have to do now is set up a front group and funnel corporate money into that front group, unlimited amounts of money, and it's very easy to pressure a lawmaker when the corruption is that simple.
Right, and the Koch brothers, of course, have mastered this. How do we stop this toxic cycle, Lee? Because, of course, in order to play the game, you got to have a lobby on the Hill now.
No, that's right. And, you know, I've talked to a lot of campaign finance experts, folks who are interested in good government, and there's a consensus that we need better laws. And I don't disagree with that necessarily, but we also need enforcement. So there's no political will at the Department of Justice, and there's no resources devoted into investigating federal corruption. I think citizens need to demand that type of enforcement because there are laws on the books. They simply aren't being enforced.
Thank you so much. Excellent work, Lee Fong, journalist, contributor at The Nation. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Abby.
That's our show, you guys. Thanks for watching. Join me again next week when I break the set all over again. Could keep the U.S. military's digital warriors and drone operators more alert. The Air Force, Army, and DARPA are all participating in 5 separate studies with a price tag of $200 grand a pop. This government already relies on video game methods to kill. So is it turning soldiers into electrical conductors really the future of warfare? I guess it's time we update that slogan. The best part of waking up is an electric shock to the dome. Now let's break the set. Draconian discrimination. See, yesterday the Arizona State Legislature just passed a law allowing business owners to refuse service to gays and lesbians, deny equal pay to females, withhold birth control for unmarried women, and skirt legal contractual obligations, all in the name of religion. Yes, that's right. This wide-ranging decree allows individuals to skirt federal and state anti-discrimination laws if the reason for doing so is on account of religious beliefs. Arizona Governor Jan Brewer has yet to decide if she will approve or veto the law, and similarly, when it comes to natural beauty, Arizona has it all. Traveling around to the state, like sites like Monument Valley, the Painted Desert, and the Petrified Forest all make you feel like a 19th century cowboy. And now there's another reason why it might seem like you went back in time to the 1800s while in the Grand Canyon State. Good old fat.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
Once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change.
What's going on, everyone? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. Do you ever get the feeling that a regular old cup of joe just isn't enough to keep you up anymore? Well, the Pentagon has a new solution that it's planning to try out on American soldiers. And I know I say this a lot, but the latest development is literally shocking because they're planning to zap their brains with electricity. That's right, the Pentagon has already begun to experiment with this new shock therapy, which it says